Crystal Dynamics' Marvel's Avengers is getting a next-generation patch releasing on the 18th of March. This patch promises greater performance and visuals for next-gen consoles, and it seems like a lot of the groundwork for this patch has been done by Nixies, a porting house who is responsible for some of the best PC versions of games I've played. So in today's video, we at Digital Foundry have been granted access to a pre-release build of this next-gen patch for the PlayStation 5 to check out what it brings to the table, both in performance, image quality, and features. So what exactly are we looking at here today, and does it live up to the quality we have seen in other next-generation efforts? For starters, the pre-release build we have access to includes the single-player component of that game, but not the multiplayer live service component. So that means the performance metrics that I will be discussing later in this video are in regards to the single-player campaign. As we noted in our coverage of the game on last generation consoles, the single-player component can have a different performance profile than that of the multiplayer, so just keep that in the back of your mind. Even with that limitation, the rest of the build does have everything else available for play, and all the upgrades entailed on the PlayStation blog, and even more, which is put right front and center when you initially boot up this game in the PlayStation 5 version on the PS5 for the first time. Like a number of other games found on these current generation machines, you essentially are given the choice of two modes of play, either preferring graphical quality or performance. The high performance mode targets 60 FPS and the high quality mode targets 30 FPS with a number of enhancements to graphical quality. The descriptions here mention targets of a 4K resolution for both, but the answer is a little bit more complex, and more on that in a little bit. Although the quality mode here mentions that it has higher quality effects work, the performance mode actually has a number of enhancements itself above what we see on last-gen machines, which I'm going to place here against the PlayStation 4 Pro version, showing that version off using the high-quality mode targeting 30 FPS that had a dynamic checkerboard rendering to help achieve that frame rate target, going in between 4K checkerboarded down to sub 1440p being checkerboarded actually. This dynamic checkerboarding setup seems to be very similar on PlayStation 5 in its highest performance mode as it's called, but with the important change of course that it now targets 60 FPS while doing so. This means there are a range of possible resolutions that you can see just like you see on the PlayStation 4 Pro. Depending upon the action on the screen, it can scale down to 0.8 axis scale, so around 1800p checkerboarded, or at the most intense moments, and rarely to a low around 1440p checkerboarded. But that would be very rare. Essentially, the more mayhem you cause, the lower the resolution can go, which aligns very well with what is possible on the PlayStation 4 Pro version and just how this game scales on PC GPUs. In general, the game, though, in its quieter moments, most definitely finds itself closer to that 4K checkerboard in terms of its visuals, and only starts scaling more often in combat. You can notice it when it happens, but I think you will notice the input response and visual fluidity of 60 FPS quite a bit more. So how about those visual upgrades? Next to the 60 FPS, the PlayStation 5 by default in this mode and the quality mode use higher resolution textures across the board. Like take this opening scene here with Kamala Khan and her father. Although her father is right up in front of the camera, direct in view, the texture on his shirt is rather low resolution on PlayStation 4 Pro. PlayStation 5, at 2 times the frame rate here, is displaying that texture in its full high-resolution glory. A great majority of the game's textures are upgraded in this manner on PlayStation 5. Like, check out the comic book dispenser here and the box right next to it in this cutscene starts on PlayStation 4 Pro. These textures are oddly low resolution on the PlayStation 4 Pro to the point where it almost looks like they have been mistakenly textured, or the texture is not loaded yet, when it actually has. The PlayStation 5, in comparison, has a pixel precision to these textures that make their surfaces look like the genuine articles. This increase in texture resolution also is visible in how aggressive or not aggressive the game's texture streaming is. In this scene on PlayStation 4 Pro, advancing forward ever so slightly, very obviously shows a change in bitmaps on the far wall with this text here in the distance. So you can see the low resolution textures rather obviously into the distance. At that same distance, the highest performance mode on PlayStation 5 uses a much higher resolution version of that same texture with no obvious flipping of that texture to a high resolution one when you advance toward it. While texture resolution is higher across the board, texture filtering is upgraded, but not as much as I might actually like. If you look here on the ground in front of Kamala in this scene, the texture on the ground is of course a lot higher resolution. Yet as it goes into the distance on PlayStation 5, you can still see it blurring out a little bit actually when it does that. You can see it perhaps a little bit better in this scene with Black Widow. Check out the gravel texture going into the distance toward Taskmaster here. It is much higher resolution on PlayStation 5 and does not blur out as quickly as PlayStation 4 Pro, but it actually still does blur out a little bit, suggesting a middling level of anisotropic filtering. Interestingly, even the high quality mode on PlayStation 5 evidences a similar level of anisotropic filtering, where you can see that same texture detail blur out a little bit as it gets into the distance. There are other upgrades though with larger effects, such as the higher quality particle effects used on PlayStation 5. On PlayStation 4 Pro, the particle effects, in my opinion, are incredibly low resolution, where they can look rather obvious at times and you can see rather big, chunky pixels appearing on the screen every time particles show up. Like here, look at this explosion front and center of the screen on PlayStation 4 Pro. These pixels cannot be hidden so very easily. In comparison, the PlayStation 5 version in high performance mode and higher quality mode use generally higher resolution particle effects, which you can see really well here when you look at this fire, where there are big chunky pixels on PlayStation 4 Pro, while that same effect on PlayStation 5 has smoothed out higher details. This may seem small in the grand scheme of things, but higher resolution particles in general give the PlayStation 5 version higher quality visuals in motion, as there's less shimmering and pixel blockiness when these particles come on screen. And as a reminder, such higher resolution particles are not cheap at all to render, which may explain why we could see some weird moments where the PlayStation 5 in this highest performance mode is actually slightly lower resolution than the PlayStation 4 Pro. The last more obvious upgrade in graphics for this highest performance mode is found in the water rendering, which is just utterly different on PlayStation 5. On PS4 Pro, the water is rendered as a flat plane with screen space reflections applied to it. On PlayStation 5, the water is given proper 3D geometric undulations and deformation on the surface, has SSR applied to it, and also has an emulated subsurface scattering effect. So you can see these kind of areas on the water surface where light is leaking through the water crests from the other side. It makes the water look quite a lot better in this version. Other aspects in this mode, though, do not see such great upgrades. Shadow resolution looks to be the exact same for one, from what I can tell, which can lead to some rather blocky looking moments when you look at the shadows that seem at odds with the rest of the game's very high quality visual package. The other area that does not get a great upgrade is in the resolution of the game's post-processing. On PlayStation 4 Pro, motion blur and depth of field resolution, like the particle resolution, is rather low, so when these effects show up on screen, the game in that moment while they are on screen looks lower resolution than it really is. Take this edge here of this model with motion blur applied to it. The character model looks suitably higher resolution, yet the motion blur applied to it has big obvious pixel chunks in it. Motion blur has the same appearance on PlayStation 5 in its high performance mode. The difference though is that the frame rate target is now 60 FPS. So the physical size of motion blur trails on screen in screen space tends to be a bit smaller, making it less obvious. As a part of this, depth of field resolution is similar on PlayStation 5 as it is on PlayStation 4 Pro. So you can sort of see bigger pixels inside the depth of field when it shows up on screen. Yet I did notice that the PlayStation 5 renders that depth of field in a slightly different manner for some reason, where the shapes of the bokeh, as they're called, are a little bit different looking at times. While looking at these bokeh shapes, you may notice that the intensity of the color behind the depth of field is a bit lessened on the PlayStation 5. Like here in this shot, where the bloomed out high contrast look behind Kamala on the Pro is darkened on the PlayStation 5. I informed Nixies of this and was notified that it is a bug that I can imagine will be fixed in the future. While there are similarities in graphical quality, the PlayStation 5 version by default is just generationally faster when it comes to loading, as Nixxes has taken the time to change their loading paradigm to take advantage of next-gen SSDs and APIs like those found in the PlayStation 5. Take, for example, just getting into the game to play it from the PlayStation dashboard. On PlayStation 5, this shot of the heroes pops up for about 4 seconds, then you're already greeted by the game's UI and can start doing whatever you want, really. Adjusting settings, loading up the game, whatever. On PlayStation 4 Pro, just getting to see the game's initial UI takes a little bit more than 24 seconds. On PS5, you could already be playing the game by this point in time, easily, as loading the game is incredibly fast. Take this loading sequence to get into the game from the main menu. On the PlayStation 5, this once again just takes a little bit more than 4 seconds until the game is loaded. To this point I chose right as the first mission's ending and there happens to be a cutscene playing. On PlayStation 4 Pro, you are going to be waiting, and a long time. In the end, it takes a full minute and 2 seconds on PlayStation 4 Pro to load this scene. I honestly have no idea how people react to these kind of loading times, as I can scarcely imagine myself playing a game that loads this long just for a cutscene. On PlayStation 5, the speed is revelatory, and Nixxes deserve huge props here for making the loading so seamless on PlayStation 5, where you just click your campaign progress in the menu, twiddle your thumbs or blink, and you're already in game. It's super awesome. So for all those aspects that high performance mode maintains from the PlayStation 4 Pro, high quality mode goes above them and then some. It targets 30 FPS at a non-checkerboarded dynamic 4K. In my play, I did not notice it fluctuating the resolution too often, not in a very noticeable way, and the only time I saw it visibly drop at one moment due to how it affected the depth of field, and I counted right here 2088p. The game's resolution of course may go lower depending upon the content, but this seems to be the rarity, and I had a hard time finding other counts other than a straight 4K. But getting back to the upgrades, let's start with post-processing that I mentioned just a bit ago. Motion blur resolution and depth of field resolution are much higher in this mode, so bokeh shapes in the background look suitably smooth without that pixelated look in them like you see in the highest performance mode. And motion blur in direct comparisons of the effect looks a lot less pixelated as well. Unlike the highest performance mode, the highest quality mode enhances the game's shadow rendering. Firstly, by increasing the resolution of shadow maps, like here with the shadow on Kamala's father in this cutscene. That has rather obvious saw teeth in the high performance mode, but it looks smooth and sharp at the same time in the highest quality mode. Or here as this cutscene ends. Notice how the enemy shadow is rather blobby and disconnected from the character in the highest performance mode. That same shadow looks much more appropriately connected and higher quality in that high quality mode. The other upgrade to the shadows is a change to their filtering. So the higher resolution shadow maps are not just uniformly sharper while being higher res. So this tree's shadow from the sun, for example, in the highest quality mode has shadows that are higher res, yet at the same time, if you notice, these shadows have a softer, almost penumbra shadow effect in comparison to the hard-edged look of the highest performance mode shadows. Lastly, this highest quality mode adds screen space shadows in, which can mean smaller, precise shadows for added detail, like the extra sharp shadowing found on this character's face here in this cutscene, or just more shadows overall, like how this confetti on the ground in this scene shows no shadows in the high performance mode, while they cast screen space shadows in the highest quality mode. Another upgrade in the high quality mode is found in the way screen space reflections are done. It's subtle but nice. As you can see here in the highest performance mode, the screen space reflection from this tall green light is the same as it is on PlayStation 4 Pro in its quality mode, where the reflection is uniformly sharp along the length of the reflection. In high quality mode on PlayStation 5, screen space reflections now adhere more realistically to surface properties. So the reflection is sharper at the point of casting here below, and gets more diffuse as the reflection moves further away from its casting point, just like they would in real life on such a surface. This generally means that reflective materials look more realistic in high quality mode, instead of just being universally shiny. Like you can see here in this image on the left, where the reflection in the highest performance mode is actually too pronounced and too shiny, whereas it is more diffuse in the highest quality mode. One of the last visual upgrades to this mode comes from an enhanced level of detail into the distance. Now this one is a little bit harder to find the differences from, but it's definitely there. Notice in this cutscene, for example, how on the right in high quality mode, there are extra objects further into the distance on the carrier deck that are not there in the highest performance mode. Small, but something. Or in this scene here, there are more scattered pedestrian models at a distance than you can see in high performance mode. A small difference once again, but one that is nice to have. The final difference of quality mode is perhaps one of my favorites, and that is enhanced destruction. To show you what I mean, here is the game in high performance 60 FPS mode as I'm playing as the Hulk, and each time as the Hulk slams the ground, there's a bit of a particle explosion, but if you notice, the particles from that disappear rather quickly, and they're ephemeral. They're not physicalized at all, so they just kind of show up but don't bounce around. Now let's switch over to the highest quality mode. Here, each time Hulk hits the ground particles are spawned as part of the effect, and they're physicalized, adding up, bouncing around and ricocheting with each hit of the ground. In direct comparison, the added effect of these particles can be hard to miss, as there's a great deal more movement and enhanced tactility to the gameplay due to these spawned physicalized particles. These are added to many effects throughout the game, but can also be really well seen in how the robot enemies slowly chip apart in the high quality mode, which reminds me a bit of Binary Domain actually, if you remember that game. It's rather neat and a substantial upgrade over last gen. Getting over to performance, this next-gen upgrade is looking extremely excellent. Let me first start with the easiest news to report on. Judging from the first few missions of the single-player campaign, including the intro, meeting Kamala and escaping the city, the desert, and then the bungle in the jungle with the Hulk, I encountered only one real frame time dip in multiple hours of play, a single frame. Whether that means massive on-screen explosions in that intro, the dense and lush jungle environment, or the fog and particle-soaked nighttime, even Hulk smashing things did not break that perfect adherence to the 30 FPS target. It is stable, and completely so. The dynamic resolution here and the general CPU headroom, I imagine, is doing a really great job to keep this game at a perfect 30 FPS. So just excellent news. Highest performance mode is a little bit different. I would say that is essentially a game that is running at a really great 60 FPS, and it will generally keep that 60 FPS through a wide variety of combat and environments, and the general mayhem that this game will definitely show off in its first few missions. When doing so, the game feels amazing to play at 60 FPS with a lot less latency and much better visual response than the 30 FPS mode. At the same time, I definitely do have to note that it's not a perfectly locked 60 FPS in the same manner that the highest quality mode definitely locks to 30 FPS. For example, in cutscenes, when the camera cuts from one view to another, the frame time can see momentary spikes to 33.3 milliseconds or even higher. This makes sense though, as each camera cut is displaying a completely different set of geometry usually, and effects within the span of one frame, and maybe the resolution before the cut was just a tad bit too high, or the CPU needed a little bit more time for the new frame view, so it was over budget. You can see this happen a number of times when playing through the campaign, but it happens in a way that is not at all detrimental to the cinematic experience. It's just not common enough. Another form of drop like this are some occasional short pauses that happen when moving through the game environment. Like here, as Kamala advances forward in the park and there's a 50 millisecond stutter that pops up. This can happen at other times, like here, you can see it happen as I am about to enter this combat. The variety and length of this momentary stutter will vary. If I had to guess, I would imagine that when this happens, it's some sort of CPU-related drop or streaming-related drop. But it happens with such infrequency that is once again not a detriment at all to the game experience, and just ends up being something where you kind of say, oh, that just happened, and then you continue on playing the game at a really great 60 FPS. The last type of drop that can be experienced are ones that are induced by calamitous combat and effects work. Here I would just assume that the resolution is maybe momentarily too high before the effects starts, and then it is on screen and it takes a little bit for the resolution to settle out or for the effects to disappear so that that nice 60 FPS refresh is maintained. And these are very small drops though when they happen though, mind you. While playing the campaign, I saw this happen multiple times in fights, especially as the Hulk, as those fights are particularly violent and destructive, and generally awesome. Still, once again, these are just minor little blips that quickly recover, and due to their infrequency, I will definitely say that they do not harm the gameplay experience in any significant manner. I would imagine most people may not even notice them, actually, and in the future, variable refresh rate being added to the PlayStation 5 will make these kind of drops essentially invisible on those with the proper television or monitor hardware. To sum it up, the game performs flawlessly in the 30 FPS highest quality mode, and generally great in the 60 FPS mode with very minor flaws that definitely do not detract at all from the cinematic or gameplay experience that this game offers. These results that I'm talking about here are once again just for the single player component, so the live service aspect may have different performance, but based upon what I'm seeing here, that would surprise me if it actually did. Getting to the end of this video, I think we're looking at a most excellent next generation upgrade to Marvel's Avengers. It looks better no matter what mode you choose, I would say. But if you have the choice between crisper visuals and effects and that gameplay boosting frame rate, the choice is simple, as 60 FPS just looks and feels great given how consistent it is at 60 FPS in this patch. This is something that the last generation consoles could not possibly do. The visual sacrifices are definitely there though, for sure, if you want to use the 60 FPS mode, but I think 60 FPS is worth any of those sacrifices. Anyway, that's enough from me for now. If you did enjoy this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to see this video in the highest quality available, support Digital Foundry on Patreon to help us out and get years worth of Digital Foundry content available in the highest quality for download. If you want to talk to me about Marvel's Avengers on PlayStation 5, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. As always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.